There is a garden, and it is the cool of the day. The Hebrew word for cool here is ruach, which also means breath, wind, spirit. The text says God walked in the garden in the breath of the day. Some scholars believe this was evening, when the desert air in the ancient Near East finally releases its heat and a low wind moves through the trees. The day is ending. The light is going gold. And something is wrong. God walks, and he calls out. And the voice that spoke light into existence, the same voice that named the stars and commanded the seas to stop at a line they could not cross, that voice calls out a single question. Where are you? 3 words. The saddest question in all of Scripture. And we are going to come back to it. But not yet. This is not a theology lecture. This is not a list of miracles. This is not a devotional you skim before breakfast. This is a study of the most terrifying and tender thing that ever happened in human history. Every recorded moment when the God who made the universe opened his mouth and spoke directly to a human being. Not through a dream. Not through a prophet. Not through a sign or a feeling or a nudge in the chest at 2 in the morning. Out loud. To a face. With words that landed like stones dropped into water, sending ripples through thousands of years. And what you will find, if you stay with me through every one of these moments, is a pattern so consistent it will change the way you read your own life. Every time God spoke directly to a man, that man was not ready. Every time God spoke, the moment looked ordinary or broken or both. And every time God spoke, the word he gave was not a comfort first, it was a call. The call always cost something. And the men who answered it became the ones the whole world still talks about. We begin where everything begins. In a garden. Before the question. Before the silence that followed. We begin with the first time God spoke to man at all. Genesis chapter 2, verse 16. God plants a garden. He puts a man in it. He walks with him. And then, before the serpent, before the fruit, before any of the tragedy that is coming, he speaks. Not in thunder. Not from a burning mountain. God speaks the way a father speaks to a child sitting next to him at the table. And quote, you may eat from every tree in the garden. And quote, every tree. The fig tree dripping with fruit. The pomegranate bursting red. The almond tree, the olive tree, the date palm heavy with clusters. All of it yours. Only this one in the center, do not eat from this one. On the day you eat from it, you will die? That is the first recorded direct speech from God to man. Not a command to conquer. Not a list of rules. A boundary, and behind the boundary, an invitation to trust. Adam heard God and Apos' voice before he ever heard anyone else and Apos'. Think about what that means. The first sound a human being ever heard that was not wind or water or birdsong was God and Apos' voice. The first conversation in human history was between a creature made of dust and the being who formed that dust with his own hands. Adam did not have a childhood. He did not have a mother and Apos' voice or a lullaby or years of slowly learning who he was. He woke up, fully formed, fully alive, and the first thing that filled his ears was the voice of the God who made him. There is no record of what that voice sounded like. But the Hebrew word used in Genesis for the way God speaks, daber, is the same word used for a thing that happens, for an event, for a reality that enters the world. In Hebrew, when God speaks, his word and the thing it creates are the same noun. He says in quote, light and quote, and light is not described, light arrives. So when God said in quote, do not eat, and quote, that word was not a suggestion. It was a reality, planted like a seed, waiting to be either honored or broken. Adam honored it. For a while. Here in Apos', that's what most people miss about the Garden of Eden. The conversations between God and Adam are not presented as extraordinary. They are presented as regular, as the texture of daily life. God walks in the garden in the cool of the day. This implies it was something he did, not once, not on a special occasion, but as a pattern. The way you walk with a friend. The way you check in. The tragedy of Genesis chapter 3 is not just that Adam and Eve ate the fruit. It is that they heard the sound of God walking toward them. The sound they had heard every evening. The sound that meant he was coming to be with them. And for the first time in their lives, they ran. They hid behind trees. And God walked into the garden. And the garden was quiet. And he called out the question he already knew the answer to. Where are you? We are going to hold that question right there. And now we need to move forward. 3,000 miles east and 2,000 years later, to a man standing at the edge of his world, with everything familiar behind him and nothing known ahead. His name was Abram. He was 75 years old. He had no children. He lived in a city called Haran, in a house he had built, among people he had known all his life. And then one day, the text gives no dramatic build-up, no trumpet sound, no warning. One day God simply spoke. End quote. Go from your country, your kindred and your father and Apos' house, to the land that I will show you. End quote. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, notes in his Antiquities that Abraham had already distinguished himself as a man who refused to worship the gods of his people, that he had argued publicly in the courts of Ur that the universe could only have been made by one intelligence, one creator. He had been unpopular for it. He had been a foreigner in his own land before God ever told him to leave. And now God speaks and gives Abraham something no one had ever been given before, a promise with no conditions. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham didn't Apos ask for a map. He didn't Apos ask how long it would take, or what the land looked like, or whether there would be water. The text says he departed, as the Lord had told him. 75 years old. No children. No map. Just a voice. And he walked toward it. Stay with me, because the second time God spoke directly to Abraham is far harder than the first, and what happens on that mountain will give you something to hold on to for the rest of your life. 25 years pass. Isaac is born, the son of promise, the boy who should not have existed, born to a woman who was 90 years old, who laughed when the angel told her it was coming. Isaac grows up. He learns to walk, to talk, to run, to laugh the way his mother laughed. And one day, again, no warning, no build-up, God speaks again. And quote, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the region of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. End quote. Abraham rises early the next morning. He saddles his donkey. He takes the wood for the fire. He takes his son. On the 3rd day of walking, Isaac looks up at his father and says, end quote, Father, I see the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? End quote. And Abraham says, end quote, God himself will provide the lamb, my son. End quote. He did not know yet how true that was. On the mountain, Abraham builds the altar. He arranges the wood. He binds his son. He lays Isaac on the altar. He reaches out his hand. He takes the knife. And God speaks again. End quote. Abraham, Abraham, end quote. The repetition of the name is not dramatic decoration. In Hebrew, when God repeats a name twice, as he will later with Moses, with Samuel, with Saul on the Damascus road, it is not emphasis. It is intimacy. It is the voice of someone who knows you so fully they do not need to explain themselves. It is the sound of a God who has been watching the whole time and is right here, right now, and wants you to know it. End quote. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. End quote. Abraham lifts his eyes. There is a ram caught in the thicket. God provided the lamb. And Abraham named the place Yahweh Yire, the Lord will see. The Lord will provide. In Hebrew, end quote, see end quote, and end quote, provide end quote, share a root, because to the God who made the mountain, seeing a need and meeting it are the same motion. Every person God spoke to in Scripture walked away changed. But Abraham walked away from Moriah, carrying something different from the rest. He walked away knowing that the God who asked for everything was the same God who gave everything back. He had heard the voice of God before, but on that mountain, he heard something underneath the voice. He heard the God who would, one day, not stop the hand, but stretch his own son across the wood instead. Every person God spoke to directly in Scripture had something in common. None of them were ready. Adam was in a garden with no map of what was coming. Abraham was 75 with no heirs and no destination. And the man we are about to meet, the one who may be the most famous direct conversation with God in all of Scripture, was hiding in a desert, tending someone else and Apos' sheep, convinced that the best years of his life were already behind him. If you are finding this video helpful, If you have ever wondered whether God still speaks and what it looks like when he does, hit subscribe right now. There are more videos coming on the patterns of God in Scripture that I think are going to change the way you read this book. And before we go any further, drop a comment below. Tell me one name from the Bible where you always wanted to know more. I read every single one. Now, a burning bush that does not burn, and the man who could not look away. His name was Moses. And when God spoke to him, Moses was 80 years old. 40 years earlier, he had been a prince of Egypt, raised in Pharaoh and Apos' palace, educated in every art of the ancient world, positioned to rule a civilization that was the most powerful force on earth. And then he had thrown it all away in one afternoon. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He killed the Egyptian. He buried him in the sand. And he ran. He ended up in Midian. He married a shepherd and Apos' daughter. He took on the work of a shepherd, the lowest rung of the economic ladder in the ancient world, the profession that Egyptians considered ritually unclean. Moses, who once wore linen and ate at Pharaoh and Apos' table, now smelled of lanolin and dust. 40 years passed. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, tending his father-in-law and Apos' flocks at the base of a mountain called Horeb, Moses saw a bush on fire. This was not unusual in a dry Middle Eastern desert. Bushes caught fire. What stopped Moses, what made him turn aside and look, is what the text says next. The bush was burning, but it was not consumed. And God spoke from the fire. End quote. Moses, Moses, end quote. There it is again, the repeated name. The sound of intimacy. Moses says, end quote, here I am, end quote. And God says, end quote, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet. The place you are standing on, it is holy ground, end quote. The ground was the same ground Moses had walked on every day for 40 years. It had not changed. Moses had not changed. The bush had not changed. What changed was that God was present. And God and Apos' presence is what makes ground holy. And this is where it gets remarkable. God does not stop at the sandals. He introduces himself. End quote. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. End quote. He says, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out. I know their suffering. And I have come down to rescue them. Moses has been hiding for 40 years from the memory of what he failed to do for those people. And God shows up in a burning bush and says, I have not forgotten. I have been watching, and I am sending you back. Moses says, end quote, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? End quote. God does not answer the question directly. God says, I will be with you. That is always the answer to end quote. Who am I? End quote. Not a resume. Not a set of qualifications. Not a reason that makes sense on paper. The answer to end quote, who am I end quote, is, I will be with you. Moses asks 5 more questions. 5 times he pushes back. What if they dawn and Apos? Believe me. I and Apos am not eloquent. I and Apos am slow of speech. Send someone else. And God is patient with every question. He answers each one. And then finally, when Moses says end quote, please send someone else end quote, the text says the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. Not because Moses was afraid. Fear is allowed. Not because Moses doubted. Doubt is allowed. But because end quote, send someone else end quote, is not a question. It is a refusal. And God had chosen Moses not because Moses was qualified, but because Moses was the one. God always chooses someone specific. He never asks for a volunteer. Moses goes back to Egypt. He stands before Pharaoh. 10 plagues fall. A sea splits down the middle like a torn curtain. 2 million people walk out of slavery on dry ground. And Moses talks to God face to face. The text says as a man speaks with a friend. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, writes in his ecclesiastical history that Moses was the first prophet of any nation to put divine speech into written form. The first human being to say, not just end quote, God spoke to me, end quote, but to write down the exact words, in sequence, for people who were not there. What Moses carried down from Sinai was not just the law. It was the record that God spoke, in specific words, to a specific man, on a specific mountain, on a specific day. Pay attention to this, because the next man we come to is the exact opposite of Moses at the burning bush. Moses was reluctant. Elijah was broken. It is possible to hear God and Apos' voice and still fall apart afterward. Elijah had just done the most dramatic thing any prophet in Israel and Apos' history had done. On Mount Carmel, he had called fire down from heaven in front of 850 false prophets and an entire nation. The fire came. The prophets of Baal were killed. The people fell on their faces and said, end quote, "The Lord, He is God," end quote. And then one woman, the queen, Jezebel, sent Elijah a message. "By this time tomorrow, you will be dead." And Elijah ran. He ran into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree, a low desert shrub, barely enough shade to cover a crouching man. And he asked God to let him die. End quote. "It is enough," end quote, he said. End quote, "I have had enough. Take my life," end quote. He lay down, and he slept. God could have spoken to him right there. God could have corrected him, challenged him, reminded him of the fire on Carmel. God did none of those things. First, God fed him. An angel touched him and said, end quote, "Get up and eat," end quote. There was bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Elijah ate and lay down again. The angel came back a second time. End quote. "Get up and eat. The journey is too much for you." End quote. God and Apos' first response to Elijah and Apos' breakdown was not a sermon. It was bread. 40 days Elijah walked, all the way to Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had stood at the burning bush. And God came to him there. End quote. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" End quote. God asks a question again, not to get information, to invite response, to give the broken man a chance to speak before God does. Elijah pours it all out. "I am the only one left. They have killed all your prophets. I am the only one left. And now they want to kill me." God says, end quote, "Go out and stand on the mountain in my presence," end quote. And then the wind comes. A great, tearing wind that splits the rocks. Then an earthquake. Then fire. But God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. After the fire, the text says, called Demamadaka, the voice of thin silence, the sound of stillness. And Elijah pulls his cloak over his face and walks to the opening of the cave. And God speaks to him. In the quiet. This is the moment that rewrites everything. Elijah had just witnessed the most spectacular display of divine power in the Old Testament. Fire from heaven. A nation on its face. And God was not in the spectacle. The spectacle was for the people. The voice, the personal voice, the direct word, came in the silence. Every prophet, every king, every ordinary person who has ever said, end quote, "I just wish God would speak to me clearly," end quote. Here is the answer hidden inside that verse. The voice of God to the individual is not thunder. It is not fire. It is the thing that remains when everything loud has passed. It is the voice of thin silence. And in that silence, Elijah heard his name. Isaiah was in the temple the year King Uzziah died. Uzziah had been one of the good kings. He had reigned for 52 years. He had built towers, dug cisterns, organized armies, and expanded the kingdom. His death left a hole in the national confidence that was hard to describe. When the king who has kept everything together dies, people look at the empty throne and feel something very close to terror. Isaiah was in the temple. Maybe he went there to grieve. Maybe he went to pray. And then the roof of the world peeled back. The text says Isaiah saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above the throne were seraphim, creatures the text describes as six-winged, crying out to each other in voices that shook the doorposts out of their frames and filled the building with smoke. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And Isaiah and Apos' response is not wonder. It is not prayer. It is confession. End quote. "Woe is me, for I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King." End quote. Direct contact with the presence of God does not produce pride. It never has. Every person in Scripture who encountered God directly, who heard his voice without a layer between them, fell apart first. Adam hid. Moses covered his face. Elijah pulled his cloak over his eyes. Isaiah saw himself clearly for the first time in his life. One of the seraphim flies to him with a live coal from the altar. It touches his lips. End quote. "Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for." End quote. And then the voice of God, into the freshly cleaned air of that moment. End quote. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? End quote. Notice what God does not do. He does not say, end quote, Isaiah, I am sending you. End quote. He opens the question. He lets the man choose. After cleaning him, after restoring him, after speaking the word of absolution over his lips, God invites a response. And Isaiah says, end quote, here I am. Send me, end quote. He had been in a room where angels were shaking. He had seen a holy God. He had been undone and remade in the same moment. And when the question came, he did not hesitate. This is what direct contact with God and Apos' voice does. It does not make you comfortable. It makes you willing. Now, there is one more voice, one more conversation, and it is the most violent and most merciful thing in the entire New Testament. The road to Damascus cuts through the Syrian desert, a dry, white road under a white sky. The year is approximately 33 AD. 3 years have passed since a man from Nazareth was crucified outside Jerusalem and buried in a borrowed tomb. And roughly 2 years since his followers began claiming he had walked out of that tomb alive. Saul of Tarsus does not believe them. He has dedicated his life to making sure they stop saying it. He is a Pharisee, Roman citizen, trained in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, the most prestigious rabbi of his generation. He speaks Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. He has watched a man named Stephen get stoned to death and approved of the execution. He is carrying official arrest documents, warrants from the high priest, authorizing him to bring any follower of Jesus in Damascus back to Jerusalem in chains. He is riding toward the city. It is midday. The sun is high, and then light. Not the light of a burning bush. Not the light of a sunrise. Light so overwhelming that every man on the road falls to the ground. Light that blinds. And inside the light, a voice. End quote, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? End quote. There it is again. The double name. The sound of intimacy. The voice that knows him, not just his name, but what he is doing and why, and what it is costing. Saul says, end quote, who are you, Lord? End quote. And the voice says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. The Greek word used here for what is happening in this moment, apocalypsis, means an uncovering, a revealing. What is being uncovered on the Damascus road is not just the identity of Jesus. What is being uncovered is everything Saul thought he knew. His entire life, his entire framework, his entire understanding of what faithfulness looked like. All of it, shattered on a road in the Syrian desert by a voice from a light so bright he could not open his eyes. He rose from the ground blind. His companions led him into Damascus by the hand. For 3 days he sat in a house on Straight Street, a road that still exists in Damascus today, without eating, without drinking, without sight. 3 days. The same number as the tomb. And then God spoke again, not to Saul this time, but to a disciple named Ananias. He told him where Saul was. He told him to go. Ananias pushed back. He knew who Saul was. He knew what Saul had done to the people in Jerusalem. And God said something that stopped the argument cold. He is my chosen instrument, to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings, and before the people of Israel. Here is the part nobody tells you about the Damascus road. The voice that stopped Saul was not a voice of judgment. It was a voice of commission. The same pattern as always. The same impossible assignment. The same God who told a 75-year-old man to leave everything, who told a fugitive shepherd to walk back into Egypt, who told a broken prophet the answer was in the silence. That same God looked at the man who had been persecuting his followers and said, I have plans for you. Ananias put his hands on Saul. Saul and Apos' sight returned. He got up and was baptized. And the man who had carried arrest warrants for followers of Jesus became the most prolific writer in the New Testament. The man who planted churches from Jerusalem to Rome. The man who wrote, I have learned in whatever state I am, to be content. Not in quote, I was born content, end quote. Learned. The hard way, starting on a road in the Syrian desert with his face in the dust. Now we come back to the garden. And we come back to the question. Go back to the garden. The cool of the day. The sound of footsteps in the grass. Adam is hiding behind a tree. Eve is with him. They have covered themselves with fig leaves, the most inadequate covering in history, and they are crouched in the shadow, listening to the sound of God walking toward them. The text says God called out, where are you? There is a parent I want you to imagine. They have a grown child, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe older. That child grew up in the house, ate at the table, heard the same voice every morning. And then one day the child made a choice that took them somewhere far away. Not far in miles. Far in the heart. And the parent walks past their old bedroom. The same room, the same walls, nothing changed. And the silence inside that room is a specific kind of grief. And sometimes the parent stands at the door and says the name, quietly, not because they expect an answer, but because not saying it feels like giving up. Where are you? God walked into that garden knowing exactly where Adam was, knowing what he had done, knowing what it would cost to fix it. God was not lost. God was not surprised. God was not asking because he needed information. He was asking because Adam needed to hear his own name in God and Apos' mouth one more time before the exile began. This is the question behind every direct word God has ever spoken to any man. Not the surface question, not in quote, go to a new land in quote, or in quote, take off your sandals in quote, or in quote, who will I send? End quote. The question underneath all the other questions. The same one he asked in the garden. Where are you? Adam hid and lost the garden. Abraham answered and became the father of nations. Moses pushed back 5 times and then went anyway and split the sea. Elijah collapsed under a tree and God fed him and spoke to him in the silence and sent him back to finish his work. Isaiah said in quote, here I am in quote, before he even knew what in quote, send me in quote, would require. And Saul was knocked off his horse and blinded and renamed and sent to the nations he had been trying to stop. Every single time God spoke directly to a man, he was asking the same thing underneath the words. Are you here? Are you with me? Do you know who I am and who you are in light of who I am? And here is the final thing. The thing that makes all of this matter for today. At the beginning of John and Apos' gospel, not a parable, not a prophecy, but the declaration that holds the whole library of Scripture together, it says this, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek here is logos, which means word, reason, the organizing principle of everything that exists. John is saying, the same voice that spoke in Eden, that called Abraham out of Ur, that spoke from the burning bush, that fed Elijah with bread and whispered in the silence. That voice did not just speak words. One day, that voice became a person. God stopped speaking from outside the story and stepped into it. And the first thing the Logos did when he grew up was walk into a synagogue and read from the scroll of Isaiah. Close it, sit down, and say, the scripture you just heard is fulfilled today. He came to say what he had always been saying, in a way that could never be misheard. He came to stand in the garden again, to call the name again, to ask the question that has never stopped being asked. Where are you? 3 takeaways. And then we and Apos, redone. First, every time God spoke directly to a man in Scripture, it was specific, personal. A name repeated twice, a question asked from a burning bush, a voice in a silence after the fire. God does not broadcast into crowds. He calls individuals. He knows your name the way he knew theirs. Second, there is not a single person in this list who was in a good position when God spoke to them. Adam had just sinned. Abraham was old and childless. Moses had been hiding for 40 years. Elijah wanted to die. Isaiah was in mourning. Saul was on his way to commit violence. If you are in the middle of something that feels like disqualification, God and Apos' call has never required you to be ready. It has only ever required you to be honest. And third, the God who stood in the garden at the cool of the day and called out in quote, where are you? End quote, was not asking because he had lost you. He knew where you were. He has always known. He asks because he wants you to stop hiding. He asks because the answer he is waiting for is the same one Moses finally gave, the same one Isaiah gave, the same one Saul gave from the dirt of a road he never expected to end up on. Here I am. That is all he has ever asked for. Which moment in this video hit you the hardest? Adam in the garden, Elijah under the tree, or Saul knocked off his horse on the road to Damascus? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of video that makes you want to keep going deeper into the patterns of God in Scripture, subscribe. There is more coming. Every week. He spoke then. He speaks now. The question is never whether God is talking. The question is whether we and Apos' gone quiet enough to hear.